Self-respect is not a slogan, a tone of voice, or a posture you strike when someone disrespects you. It is an internal economy. It determines the kind of emotional transactions you are willing to engage in, the price you are willing to pay for peace, and the threshold at which you walk away. Before we dive into 5 habits that make a self-respecting woman impossible to manipulate, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Most women are taught to barter their worth early, trained to earn affection through sacrifice, to tolerate mistreatment for belonging, and to mistake silence for maturity. But a self-respecting woman no longer plays in that market. She has exited the emotional bargain bin where love is conditional, attention is inconsistent, and respect is treated like a reward instead of a given. She does not audition for decency. She does not explain why she deserves kindness. She does not chase people who only value her when she is quiet, small, or useful. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That privilege requires boundaries. It requires leaving the stage where your performance earned applause but your truth earned rejection. Self-respect is not about arrogance or stubbornness. It is about spiritual hygiene. It is knowing that if you let people treat you like a convenience, they will. If you don't set the rate for your emotional labor, someone else will discount it. And if you let guilt override your gut, you will keep betraying yourself in the name of love. A woman who respects herself doesn't just think she deserves more, she embodies it, and that embodiment makes her a mirror. People either rise to meet her energy or recoil from it, because self-respect forces clarity. You cannot manipulate someone who isn't afraid to lose you. You cannot guilt-trip someone who has made peace with being misunderstood. You cannot control someone who knows how to walk away without fireworks, without a monologue, without turning it into a performance. Her presence becomes a filter. The wrong ones fall away not because she chased them, but because their tactics have no grip on her. She sees the game. She's not mad at it, she's just uninterested. That indifference is her power. Not the icy kind built from trauma, but the sacred kind built from healing. It is the knowing that her time is precious, her peace is expensive, and her energy is not up for auction. It is how she chooses what to engage with, what to release, and what to never explain again. She doesn't need to clap back, defend, or perform closure. She simply doesn't stay where she isn't respected, and that quiet refusal becomes a roar. In a world that survives on women doubting themselves, questioning their intuition, and staying silent to be polite, her self-respect is revolutionary. It disrupts patterns. It ends cycles. It burns scripts. And for manipulators who thrive on confusion, her clarity is unbearable. They cannot twist her words because she speaks in truth. They cannot bait her into chaos because she lives in calm. They cannot dominate her because she already governs herself. She is not cruel. She is not hardened. She is simply no longer available for anything less than mutuality. And that makes her impossible to manipulate, not because she fights harder, but because she no longer plays. Her boundaries are not walls. They are invitations for others to rise. And if they cannot, she lets them fall away, not with anger, but with peace. That is the currency of self-respect. It is the wealth no one can steal, the fortress no one can breach, the standard no one can lower without your permission, and once she holds it, she never gives it back. There is a quiet power that settles into a woman the moment she stops outsourcing her worth to the people around her. Carl Jung called it the individuation process, the sacred psychological unfolding of the self, where the ego is no longer the master, but the servant of a deeper truth. For the self-respecting woman, this is not a concept, it is her lived experience. While many chase approval, consensus, and external markers of validation, she turns inward and asks a far more dangerous question: what is true for me, even if no one claps for it? That question becomes the beginning of her freedom. Because a woman who has found her inner authority no longer bows to emotional extortion, social pressure, or manipulative guilt. She has cracked the code of her conditioning. She sees where she was taught to be likable instead of honest, agreeable instead of authentic, desirable instead of whole. She sees how the world profits from her uncertainty, and how manipulative people thrive when a woman fears her own power. So she reclaims it not with noise, but with knowing. Not with rebellion, but with return. Jung believed that every human has a self that longs for integration, a center that does not shift with public opinion or personal rejection. When a woman discovers that center, she becomes untouchable in the deepest sense. Not because she resists vulnerability, but because she no longer confuses visibility with worth. She can walk into a room and not be seen, and still know that she exists. She can be overlooked and not collapse. She can be criticized and not shatter, because her sense of self is no longer on the table. That is the terror for those who seek to control her. They cannot enter her mind because she no longer hands them the key. She does not ask them what she deserves. She does not beg them for kindness. She does not require them to agree in order for her to trust herself. The woman who embodies inner authority has made peace with her own shadow. She does not flinch when people project their unhealed pain onto her, because she knows what is hers and what is not. She does not need to correct every false perception or defend every misunderstood intention. She is no longer performing sanity for people who weaponize her empathy. That clarity is disarming, because insecure people expect women to fold, to question, to contort. They expect hesitation where she offers certainty. They expect flattery where she offers truth. They expect compliance where she offers stillness. Her inner authority is not loud, but it is absolute. It is the invisible spine that holds her upright when others try to bend her. It is the whisper that says, "This is not for me," and the courage to walk away without theatrics. She does not fear loneliness, because she has met herself in the silence and found someone she can trust. She does not fear disapproval, because she has survived her own self-rejection and come back stronger. Jung taught that wholeness is the goal, not perfection, and she is whole. Whole in her softness and strength, whole in her boundaries and compassion, whole in her clarity and mystery. That wholeness makes her impossible to gaslight, because her reality is no longer up for debate. It makes her impossible to guilt, because she knows the difference between obligation and alignment. And it makes her impossible to manipulate, because the seat of her power is internal. She is governed not by the hunger to be chosen, but by the truth of who she is, and that truth does not move for anyone. A self-respecting woman doesn't need a psychological manual to identify manipulation. She feels it in her body before her mind can name it. Her breath shortens, her shoulders tense, and a quiet whisper inside her says, "This is off." That whisper is not anxiety. It's her intuition, sharpened by years of being gaslit, dismissed, and coerced into doubting herself. She has learned to recognize the shape of manipulation not because she studied it, but because she has survived it. She has been through the cycle, the praise that precedes the control, the flattery that camouflages the guilt, the passive-aggressive silences that punish her for saying no. And now, she sees it with X-ray vision. Carl Jung wrote that the unconscious will continue to direct your life until you make it conscious. A self-respecting woman has made her unconscious patterns conscious. She no longer confuses love with rescue. She no longer interprets intensity as intimacy. She no longer mistakes someone's woundedness for a license to harm her. That clarity makes her dangerous to manipulators, because she does not bite the bait. When someone tries to distort the truth with half compliments or loaded silences, she does not engage. She doesn't try to fix, decode, or explain her worth in response to their confusion. She sees the pattern, names it silently, and steps back. Manipulators rely on her forgetting herself in order to win control, but she remembers. She remembers what it felt like to betray her gut in the name of keeping the peace. She remembers the shame that came from appeasing someone who never intended to meet her halfway. And she remembers the exact moment she promised herself she would never again negotiate with someone who benefits from her self-abandonment. That memory is her shield. So now, when she's met with coercion dressed as kindness or blame wrapped in faux concern, she smiles without softness, not out of cruelty, but because she sees clearly. She is not cold. She is precise. She knows that manipulation loses its power the moment you stop needing validation from the source of the manipulation. Insecure people are unnerved by this because they expect her to bend, to over-explain, to collapse into apology. But she doesn't. She simply exits the dynamic without fanfare. That exit is a revolution, because manipulators do not know what to do with someone who doesn't give them the reaction they crave. They will call her difficult, cold, distant, unfeeling. But she is none of those things. She is discerning, and her discernment is born of hard-won healing. Jung taught that the shadow contains everything we refuse to see about ourselves. Manipulators live in denial of that shadow. But she doesn't. She has made peace with her darkness, which means she is no longer afraid of confrontation. She will not lash out or seek revenge, but she will not stay in a conversation designed to confuse her. That self-trust is terrifying to those who depend on power imbalances. She is not looking for a savior, a teacher, or a fixer. She is looking for truth, and if the energy does not match her integrity, she disengages. No tantrum, no theatrics. Just silence that speaks louder than any scream. Because the first habit of a self-respecting woman is not what she says, it's what she refuses to respond to. And that refusal, when anchored in calm certainty, is the first form of freedom. She recognizes manipulation not as a puzzle to solve, but as a door to walk away from, and she walks with her head high. Every manipulator, whether subtle or overt, plays a silent game of emotional excavation, digging not for truth, but for weakness. And the weakness they count on is not incompetence or naivete. It is the unhealed wound of abandonment. Carl Jung believed that our unresolved wounds become the lens through which we interpret reality. For many women, especially those taught from childhood to equate love with compliance, the deepest wound is the belief that they must earn belonging by being less of themselves. It begins quietly. A withdrawn parent, a withheld compliment, a smile that vanishes when she asserts herself. These moments are small in isolation, but together they teach a dangerous lesson, that love is conditional and that rejection is a verdict on her worth. A manipulator senses this wound like smoke signals from across a room. They sense the overcompensating, the need to be chosen, the silent hope that if she's good enough, she won't be left. And so they dangle connection like a carrot, offering attention only when obedience is guaranteed. They create atmospheres where she walks on emotional eggshells, terrified that a misstep will lead to silence, shaming, or withdrawal. But a self-respecting woman has stopped mistaking this game for love. She sees it for what it is, a reenactment of her earliest pain, and she chooses not to play. The wound may still ache, but it no longer drives her. She no longer fears the cold shoulder of someone who uses absence as a weapon. She has faced her own loneliness and survived it. She has walked through the dark corridors of self-doubt and emerged not perfect, but present. Jung taught that what we do not make conscious will return to us as fate. A woman who has made this particular wound conscious cannot be manipulated by it. She may feel the old pull to please, to fix, to prove, but she breathes through it instead of obeying it. That breath is her defiance. It says, I see you trying to make me small so you can feel big. I see you trying to trigger my fear of being alone so I'll accept less than I deserve. And she doesn't fall for it. Because she knows that true connection never requires the betrayal of her own nervous system. She knows that anyone who punishes her for having needs or boundaries is not a partner, but a puppeteer. And she will not be strung along. The wound of abandonment used to make her apologetic. Now it makes her aware of the games people play to maintain control. Aware of the way shame is passed down like inheritance. Aware of how emotional starvation masquerades as intimacy, and in that awareness, she is free. She no longer attaches to those who disappear when she speaks her truth. She no longer takes the bait of faux concern that is really about compliance. She no longer opens her heart to those who see her power as a threat to be neutralized. This woman is not hard, she is healed. And that healing is terrifying to manipulators because they cannot wound what has already been witnessed and embraced. She holds her past not as a source of shame, but as proof of what she's overcome. And when someone tries to use that past to control her, they are met not with fear, but with the stillness of someone who knows she no longer needs to beg for what she is now capable of giving herself. That stillness is her armor, and from that place she cannot be moved. The second habit that makes a self-respecting woman impossible to manipulate is this: she speaks the truth without performance, without softening it to be palatable or hardening it to be intimidating. She simply tells the truth, clean and unpolished, like water poured straight from the source. And in a world conditioned to prize the illusion of harmony over the discomfort of honesty, that truth feels dangerous. Carl Jung spoke of the tension between persona and shadow, the mask we wear versus the truth we suppress. A self-respecting woman has dropped the mask. She no longer adjusts her tone to be more agreeable, nor does she pretend to be unaffected to seem strong. She doesn't over-explain her no, doesn't dilute her standards with nervous laughter, and doesn't make herself small just to preserve someone else's ego. She has learned that manipulation thrives in spaces where truth is edited to avoid conflict, so she does not edit. She tells you what she feels, what she sees, and what she will or will not accept. Not to wound you, not to win, but to honor herself. That level of clarity is disarming to those who rely on confusion to maintain control. Manipulators count on their target staying quiet, second-guessing herself, rehearsing her responses in her head. But a self-respecting woman speaks before shame can distort her meaning. Her voice may not be loud, but it is precise, and when she speaks the air changes, because she speaks without needing agreement. That terrifies those who only feel powerful when they are being obeyed. She is not rude, she is honest, and that honesty is its own form of discipline. It means she no longer flatters to keep the peace. It means she no longer says she's fine when she's not. It means she no longer carries the emotional labor of managing other people's reactions to her boundaries. Jung wrote that truth does not become clear by avoiding confrontation, but by going through it. This woman knows that. She has gone through it. She has been the girl who swallowed her voice, who smiled through discomfort, who absorbed blame just to hold on to connection. And she has buried that girl with love. Now, she is a woman who chooses truth over approval. She knows that anyone who cannot handle her honesty cannot handle her, period. There is no performance in her speech, no manipulation in her tone. If she compliments you, she means it. If she disagrees, she says so without drama, and if something hurts her, she names it. That transparency confuses people who are used to double meanings and emotional charades. They call her intimidating when what they really mean is unmanageable. Because she cannot be guilt-tripped, baited, or emotionally blackmailed into silence, she has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. That makes her dangerous to manipulators because their tactics depend on distortion, but she walks in clarity, and when you walk in clarity, manipulation shatters against your presence. She does not argue to be right, she speaks to be known, and if someone cannot honor that, she does not chase or plead or perform, she simply stops talking, and that silence is not a retreat, it is a boundary. Because this is the second habit of a self-respecting woman. She speaks the truth, not to persuade, but to be free, and freedom, to her, matters more than being liked. There is a quiet, devastating power in a woman who no longer needs to emotionally attach to dysfunction in order to feel secure, and this is where the third habit of the self-respecting woman emerges. Emotional detachment. Not coldness, not indifference, but the cultivated discipline to observe rather than absorb. Carl Jung taught that suffering is not just what happens to us, but how we relate to etho. We attach meaning, identity, and even worth to the very things that break us. A woman who has done her inner work sees this clearly. She no longer feels the need to tether her emotional state to how well others treat her. If someone ghosts her, she doesn't spiral into self-loathing. If someone blames her for their own immaturity, she doesn't shrink to make it right. If someone tries to withhold affection or approval as a way to control her, she doesn't lean in, she leans back. Because she understands the difference between love and control. Insecure people confuse emotional detachment with cold-heartedness, but it is actually a sign of deep presence. She is so rooted in herself that she no longer chases peace outside her own skin. She no longer clings to relationships as lifeboats, nor does she audition for loyalty by tolerating disrespect. And this unnerves those who expect her to fold at the first sign of disapproval. A manipulator's game is most effective when the target is desperate for emotional regulation from the outside world. But she regulates herself. She cries, but not for attention. She walks away, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Her detachment is not a shield, it is a choice. It says, I can care without clinging. I can love without losing myself. I can engage without becoming entangled. And this scares those who once fed off her emotional reactivity. They find themselves disarmed by her stillness, by her refusal to be baited into chaos. Emotional detachment, in its most evolved form, is an act of profound self-respect. It is the woman's way of telling herself, "You do not have to lose your peace just because someone else lost theirs." It allows her to hold space for others without being consumed by their projections. It allows her to discern the difference between what is hers to carry and what was never hers to begin with. Jung wrote that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off parts of ourselves, but by integrating them, by knowing when to open and when to close, when to stay and when to walk. This woman does not shut down her feelings. She simply doesn't hand them over to people who haven't earned the right to hold them, and in doing so, she becomes unshakable, not unreachable, not emotionally distant, but sovereign. People may call her intimidating, difficult, or detached, but what they're really saying is that she can no longer be manipulated through fear, guilt, or shame. She feels her feelings without making them anyone else's responsibility. That is power, that is maturity, that is emotional freedom. And once a woman has tasted that, there's no going back. Her detachment is not a wall. It is a boundary made of wisdom, and those who try to shake it will find they are not fighting her, they are fighting their own reflection in the mirror of her calm. The third habit that makes a self-respecting woman impossible to manipulate is her radical trust in her own intuition, even when it costs her approval. In a world that grooms women to question themselves and seek validation before making a move, this is a kind of quiet rebellion. Carl Jung understood the psyche as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, and it is in that liminal space where intuition lives not as superstition, but as ancient intelligence. A self-respecting woman has learned to listen to that whisper within, that knowing that has no linear proof, that feeling in the body that stiffens around dishonesty or softens around truth. She no longer requires someone else's confirmation to act on her instincts. She knows when something feels off, even if everyone else is smiling. She senses when a word, a glance, a shift in energy means more than it appears, and she doesn't gaslight herself into pretending she's overthinking. She has done that before. She has silenced her inner voice in the name of harmony, in the name of keeping the peace, only to find that it cost her more than it ever protected. So now, she chooses differently. When her intuition says no, she listens. When it says leave, she walks. When it says pause, she waits. This terrifies manipulators because their power thrives in the fog of self-doubt. They rely on her not trusting herself. They count on her being so unsure of her own perceptions that she will defer to theirs. But that game no longer works. She is not looking for someone to tell her what's real. She already knows. And if her knowing makes someone uncomfortable, she does not feel the need to explain it away. She does not argue about her truth. She simply exits the conversation. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. She does not believe herself to be above error, but she does believe that her body remembers things her mind has not yet processed. She respects the wisdom that speaks through her breath, her chest, her belly. And that respect for her inner signal renders her immune to manipulation that depends on confusion. A self-respecting woman with strong intuition can see behind charm, beneath flattery, and beyond credentials. She can hear the contradiction between someone's words and their energy. She can feel the hidden agenda in a compliment. And when she does not make excuses for it. She does not ask the manipulator to explain themselves. She does not turn it into a teaching moment. She simply withdraws her energy, her access, and her trust. This is power. It is not loud. It is not performative. It is not the kind of power that announces itself. But it is the kind of power that makes those with bad intentions rethink their approach, because they can no longer penetrate her through praise or undermine her with doubt. She has made a vow to never again betray herself for the comfort of others, and that vow has made her a fortress. A woman who trusts her intuition is a woman who is no longer available for manipulation. She does not need to be told who she is. She remembers, she returns, she rests in that knowing, like a woman who has finally come home. That is the third habit, and once it is embodied, it cannot be undone. When a woman becomes fluent in her own intuition, emotionally detached from drama, and firm in her boundaries, something inevitable begins to happen. The entire architecture of manipulation crumbles in her presence. This is the collapse of control tactics. the unraveling of power plays that once worked so easily on the version of her who was starving for connection, approval, or the illusion of safety. Carl Jung understood that what we resist in ourselves, we attempt to control in others, and manipulators are often deeply fragmented individuals who cannot face their own shadows. Instead, they outsource that discomfort by trying to dominate those around them. But when a self-respecting woman refuses to play the role, the system breaks. She no longer responds to passive aggression with people-pleasing. She no longer rushes to explain herself when someone misrepresents her. She no longer takes the bait when someone tries to provoke her into emotional labor. This sends shockwaves through the relational dynamics of those who once saw her as pliable. Suddenly, their usual methods no longer yield results. Guilt trips fall flat. Silent treatments no longer provoke fear. Love bombing feels obvious. Gaslighting sounds ridiculous. Why? Because she's not fighting back, she's not even engaging. Her absence of reaction becomes more powerful than any counterattack, and that silence terrifies those who once fed off her chaos. Jung believed that the most dangerous truth is the one we are not ready to hear about ourselves, and when this woman holds up the mirror of indifference, it forces the manipulator to confront just that. She is no longer a character in their narrative. She is no longer giving them material to work with. Her composure becomes a confrontation. Her disengagement becomes a declaration. Her peace becomes her protest. This is the collapse. It's subtle, it's quiet, but it is absolute. Control tactics cannot survive in the soil of sovereignty. The more the manipulator tries to regain control, the more desperate and transparent they become. They escalate. They reach for old scripts. But she has already outgrown the theater. She no longer sits in the front row of their performance. She no longer claps for their masks. And because of this, she is free. Not just from the manipulator, but from the part of herself that once needed them. This collapse is not just the destruction of external control. It is the liberation of internal power. She is no longer defined by the roles she used to play: caretaker, fixer, empath, forgiver. She is now the author of her own presence, the protector of her own peace, and the witness to her own evolution. Control tactics lose all their grip when met with a woman who is no longer looking for someone else to validate her worth. There is nothing to hook into, nothing to manipulate, nothing to exploit. She has become a sealed channel, a sacred boundary, a lighthouse with no need to chase ships. This is the quiet collapse that terrifies those who used to feel powerful by diminishing others. They now stand before her, not as puppeteers, but as exposed people whose tools have rusted in her light, and all she had to do was rise. The fourth habit that makes a self-respecting woman impossible to manipulate is her refusal to speak in euphemisms or walk on emotional eggshells. She names things as they are, not louder, not harsher. Just clearly, just truthfully. Carl Jung believed that the process of individuation, the journey to psychological wholeness, requires that we make the unconscious conscious, and that includes calling out what has long been hidden, distorted, or softened for the comfort of others. A self-respecting woman who has done her inner work no longer cushions reality for the sake of fragile egos. She does not rename betrayal as miscommunication. She does not frame emotional abuse as someone having a hard time. She does not dress up manipulation in the clothes of love. She says what it is. And that kind of clarity dismantles every lie manipulative people use to maintain control. Because manipulation only thrives in confusion, and confusion only thrives when language is distorted. When she names the pattern, the gaslighting ends. When she names the boundary, the negotiation stops. When she names the discomfort, the mask falls. She does not need to dramatize or condemn. Her power is not in volume but in precision, and that precision is disarming. Insecure or controlling individuals often expect a woman to internalize the blame, to keep the peace by losing her voice, to doubt her experience so they never have to look at themselves. But when she says, "That was cruel," or "This is a pattern," or "I don't accept this," she breaks the trance. She becomes impossible to redirect. They cannot shift the story without her consent, and she is no longer offering it. This does not mean she is confrontational. It means she is rooted. She is not reacting for effect. She is speaking for alignment. She is not trying to prove her worth. She is protecting her energy. And because she is not attached to how others perceive her truth, she is willing to stand alone in it. That terrifies manipulators. They are used to women backing down when things get uncomfortable, but this woman does not fear discomfort. She has sat with herself long enough to know that pain is not the enemy delusion is. And because of that, she chooses clarity over comfort every time. She names what is happening not to control others, but to remain in integrity with herself. She understands that watered-down language is a form of self-abandonment, that every time she avoids the truth to keep someone else from feeling shame, she absorbs that shame as her own, and she no longer participates in that exchange. Her words now serve truth, not diplomacy. And her life reflects that shift. The people around her are not confused about where she stands. The relationships in her orbit are not built on performance, but on presence. Because when you name things as they are, you clear the fog, and in that clarity, only those who are ready for truth remain. The rest fall away. Not because she pushed them, but because the game can no longer be played on her terms. That is the fourth habit. She names it, she faces it, and because of that, she cannot be moved. Power has a language, but it is not always loud. It is not in shouting matches or declarations made from a stage. True power whispers, and the woman who has reclaimed herself speaks it fluently. The language of power is restraint without suppression, clarity without cruelty, and presence without performance. Jung knew that authentic power emerges when the ego is no longer grasping, when the self is aligned with a deeper truth that does not require external validation. A self-respecting woman who is fluent in this language no longer overshares to feel seen, no longer over-explains to be understood, and no longer over-functions to prove she is enough. Her words are measured, not because she is timid, but because she understands the weight they carry. She has made a vow to herself to stop leaking energy into spaces that distort her meaning. When she speaks, it is intentional, and when she is silent, it is sacred. This unnerves those who once relied on her need to be liked, her willingness to keep conversations going long after they turned into covert accusations, or her instinct to soften the truth to preserve relationships that no longer honored her. The language of power is not about dominating others. It's about owning the tone of your life. It's how she holds her gaze when someone lies to her. It's how she exits without drama when someone crosses her line. It's how she listens without absorbing, how she answers without defensiveness, how she lets silence do the work when noise would only dilute her knowing. Manipulators cannot survive in this frequency. They depend on emotional chaos, urgency, guilt, and confusion, but her power creates stillness, and stillness makes the truth too loud to ignore. Her voice may be soft, but her presence is unshakable, because she is no longer trying to be palatable. She is no longer bending to earn connection. She is no longer asking for permission to take up space. She knows who she is, and that knowing becomes the current that moves everything around her. Those who try to twist her words find nothing to grip. Those who try to bait her into arguments walk away holding their own shadows. Her calm becomes their mirror, her poise becomes their confrontation. The language of power is not spoken with bravado but with discernment. It is felt in the energy beneath her words, the authority behind her boundaries, and the quiet certainty that she does not need anyone to agree with her in order to trust herself. Jung taught that integration means embracing all parts of ourselves, especially the ones we were told to hide. And this woman has done that work. She does not speak to seek approval. She speaks to align with truth. She does not perform wisdom, she embodies it, and because of that, her presence is not just heard, it is felt, in every room, in every silence, in every no, in every goodbye. That is the language of power, and once you speak it, you cannot be manipulated, you can only be met. The fifth habit that makes a self-respecting woman impossible to manipulate is her ability to walk away without theatrics, negotiation, or delayed exits masquerading as hope. She does not make a scene. She does not scream her worth into rooms that only echo silence. She simply leaves. Jung said that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. A woman who has done the inner work knows that staying in relationships where she must contort her truth to feel safe is a deeper kind of abandonment than walking away alone. So she chooses solitude over self-betrayal. She has made peace with the grief that comes from releasing people who only loved her when she was convenient. Her self-respect is not just a posture, it is a practice, one that becomes most visible in how she exits what no longer serves her. Insecure or manipulative people thrive on the drama of a drawn-out ending. They rely on emotional tethering, on keeping her hooked just enough to extract one more apology, one more explanation, one more chance to spin the narrative in their favor, but she gives them nothing to spin. No final texts filled with anguish, no public displays of pain dressed up as power, no cryptic social media posts hoping they'll come back changed. She walks, quietly, completely, with her dignity intact, and that terrifies those who need chaos to feel in control, because her calm makes their dysfunction undeniable. Her silence becomes their mirror. She understands now that not every closure needs a conversation, not every betrayal needs a confrontation, not every goodbye needs to be mutual. Sometimes healing means ending a story mid-sentence and refusing to turn the page just to satisfy someone else's ego. She has learned to recognize when her presence is being exploited, when her empathy is being weaponized, when her forgiveness is being taken for granted, and in those moments, she no longer explains, she no longer pleads, she no longer waits, she simply chooses herself. That is the revolution. That is the habit that disarms manipulation at its root. Because to walk away without drama is to say, I will not be baited, I will not be broken, and I do not need to prove that I'm worth staying for. She already knows she is. And anyone who makes her forget is no longer welcome in her story. Her detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. It is the result of nights spent in reflection, of journals filled with self-questioning, of therapy sessions where she learned to stop calling dysfunction love. Now, her exits are not reactions. They are decisions, they are declarations that she no longer feeds what drains her. She no longer nurses the wound of almost love. She no longer performs peace for the sake of others while waging war inside herself. When she walks, it is final, it is clean, it is not meant to punish, but to preserve. Because this time, she chooses not to lose herself trying to hold on to someone else. That is habit 5. She walks away, not to be seen, not to be chased, not to be missed, but to be free. And in that freedom, she becomes unreachable to those who once thrived on her pain. There comes a point in every self-respecting woman's life when emotional bargaining loses its allure, when the subtle negotiations she once made to feel loved, seen, or chosen begin to feel like self-erasure in disguise. She no longer trades pieces of her soul for crumbs of attention, or rewrites her standards just to keep the peace in rooms where war is waged through silence, passive jabs, or conditional affection. Jung wrote that neurosis is often the result of a refusal to endure legitimate suffering, and for the self-respecting woman, this truth becomes her turning point. She stops numbing the grief of unmet expectations by performing who they want her to be. She stops trying to earn closeness through over-functioning or being easy to love. Emotional bargaining, she realizes, is not just exhausting, it's manipulative to herself. Every time she says yes when she means no, every time she downplays her needs to remain palatable, every time she tolerates disrespect disguised as humor, she is in silent negotiation with her own self-worth. But the healed woman is no longer available for those deals. She is not a diplomat at the table of her own violation. She is not a peacekeeper when the war is against her truth. Now, her emotions are not tools of transaction, they are sacred messengers. If she feels neglected, she listens. If she feels dismissed, she doesn't overanalyze each pivots. If she feels tension in her body during a conversation, she doesn't brush it off, she names it. The end of emotional bargaining is the beginning of deep self-trust, where she no longer seeks confirmation from people who benefit from her confusion. Manipulators often thrive when a woman doubts her instincts, when she waffles between what she feels and what she's told to believe. But this woman no longer lives in that gap. Her gut is no longer gaslit by charm or weaponized empathy. She trusts the wince, she follows the unease. She honors the version of herself who once stayed too long, and she does so by leaving sooner now. She stops explaining her pain to those committed to misunderstanding it. She stops bargaining with people who see boundaries as obstacles rather than invitations to grow. And most of all, she stops making herself the villain in someone else's discomfort. The end of emotional bargaining means she no longer needs a roundtable discussion about whether her needs are too much. They are not too much for the right people. They never were. She doesn't need to become less sensitive. She needs to be surrounded by people who can meet her depth. She doesn't need to be easier to love. She needs to be loved by people who don't confuse difficulty with dignity. This shift terrifies those who once relied on her emotional flexibility, her ability to bend and twist herself into a version that wouldn't threaten their egos, but she no longer flinches at disapproval. She no longer fears the loss of people who were only ever there to keep her small. Her peace is not up for negotiation. Her worth is not a talking point. Her emotions are not evidence of weakness, but of wisdom. She no longer bargains. She chooses. She no longer begs. She walks. And in that unwavering stance, she becomes impossible to manipulate, because she finally sees herself as worthy of everything she used to plead for. There is a silent panic that brews inside the hearts of insecure people when they realize they cannot control you, and that panic often masquerades as resentment, mockery, or sudden detachment. It is not love that leaves when you stand firm, it is power that slips through their fingers, and those who depended on your compliance begin to retreat when your clarity no longer bends. Jung taught that the possession of power, even over the self, triggers the projection of the shadow in others. So when a self-respecting woman refuses to shrink for approval, what they see is not her strength. They see the parts of themselves they have never confronted. A woman who cannot be emotionally manipulated becomes a mirror they cannot bear to face, because her presence highlights the absence of integrity in their own behavior. That's why they say she changed. That's why they accuse her of being cold, distant, or difficult. But what they really mean is she stopped being predictable. She stopped being manageable. She stopped offering them emotional access in exchange for nothing. They can't handle her peace because they fed off her chaos. They can't handle her silence because it exposes their noise. And most of all, they can't handle her freedom because it reminds them that real love cannot be coerced, contained, or controlled. In the past, she may have mistaken love for loyalty to pain. She may have stayed in cycles where manipulation was rebranded as passion, where jealousy was disguised as care, where isolation was passed off as protection. But now she knows that any connection that depends on her silence, her submission, or her forgetfulness of self is not a connection at all. It is control in costume. And what they cannot control, they cannot keep. They cannot keep her attention when they offer only performance and no presence. They cannot keep her body when her soul is aching to be heard. They cannot keep her trust when they've shown her time and again that their loyalty was situational. This realization does not make her bitter. It makes her honest. It makes her intentional. It makes her finally aligned with the kind of love that requires no manipulation to exist. A love that allows space, freedom, individuality, and mutual respect. She no longer fears being alone, because she knows now what it means to be lonely in a room full of people who love her conditionally. She no longer tries to over-explain herself, because the right people won't need a thesis statement to understand her boundaries. She no longer believes that love is about convincing, sacrificing, or staying small just to be tolerated. Love, real love, honors the full self. And manipulation? It only survives where there is fear. But fear has no place in her story anymore. They will call her difficult, but she is simply no longer willing to be easy to deceive. They will call her intimidating, but it is their dishonesty that is trembling. They will call her too much, but it's because they've only ever loved women who knew how to disappear. She does not disappear anymore. She does not dilute. She does not dance for breadcrumbs. She shows up as she is and lets the wrong people walk. Because the moment she became unmanageable was the moment she became unforgettable. There is a particular kind of loneliness that arrives not when you're abandoned by others, but when you stop abandoning yourself. It's a sacred loneliness, quiet and unflinching, that meets the woman who no longer pretends, no longer compromises her values, no longer trades authenticity for inclusion. This is the solitude that appears after the storm, when you've walked away from people who needed your silence to feel safe, from dynamics where being chosen meant being erased, from relationships that required you to bleed just to keep the peace. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, The process of becoming whole by confronting the unconscious, and it is through this path that a woman finds herself alone, not because she is unworthy, but because she is unwilling to fragment herself any longer. This loneliness is not punishment, it is proof. Proof that she has chosen herself over the illusion of belonging. Proof that she has refused to be the emotional mule for those who never learned to carry their own weight. In this space, there are no quick validations, no external applause, no safety net of performative connection. It is just her truth, and the echoes of who she used to be. And yet, this is where she begins to hear herself again. This is where her intuition sharpens, where her nervous system recalibrates, where she breathes without bracing. She may miss the people who once felt like home, but she no longer misses the feeling of betraying herself to keep them close. She may grieve the version of her that tolerated so much just to be liked, but she does not want to be that woman again. That woman was loved for her compliance, not her wholeness. That woman had to shapeshift to survive. But this woman, sitting in the quiet of her own reclamaciones, done surviving, she is living now. And living means walking through the fire of loneliness without rushing back to the hands that lit the match. It means letting the silence speak, letting the grief wash through, letting the discomfort carve out room for deeper joy later. The sacred loneliness is not a flaw in the process, it is the process. It is the shedding, the sifting, the clearing out of the noise that once kept her from hearing herself. And while others may misread her solitude as sadness, she knows better. She knows the difference between being alone and being lost. She knows that honoring herself will sometimes look like detachment, like distance, like disappearing from circles that once called her sister or lover or friend. And she lets them misunderstand. She lets them go. Because the only thing more painful than being alone is being surrounded by people who distort your reflection, who demand your silence, who cannot see your light without flinching. So she sits in this sacred loneliness like a woman on holy ground, tending to her heart as if it were a temple, and in time she learns that this space is not empty, is full of her voice, her values, her unshakable sense of worth. She is not waiting to be found. She is not waiting to be rescued. She is not waiting for the next illusion to make her forget her truth. She has found her way back. And in that finding, she becomes whole. There comes a moment in the life of every self-respecting woman when she stops negotiating with people who only understand power through dominance and love through possession, and that moment becomes her quiet rebirth. She is no longer the woman who flinches at silence, who stutters out apologies for things that are not her fault, who twists herself into softer shapes to be less threatening to fragile egos. She is not hostile, not hardened, not unkind, but she is immovable. The storms that once dismantled her are now mere weather reports she watches with unshaken calm. The words that once cut into her now echo back empty, unable to reach the places that have been fortified by truth. Carl Jung understood that individuation, true psychological wholeness, was not about perfection, but about integration. This woman has integrated. She has looked at her shadow and chosen not to be ruled by it. She has felt her fear and walked anyway. She has cried in locked bathrooms and on long drives, has picked herself up off kitchen floors where no one else noticed she had fallen, and now she walks with a steadiness that comes not from never breaking, but from learning how to rebuild herself every time she did. She no longer asks for permission to be real. She no longer offers emotional discounts to be understood. She no longer waters herself down for people who cannot hold depth, and because of that, she confuses those who once manipulated her with ease. They cannot guilt her, they cannot bait her. They cannot push her into old roles where she once made herself small to keep the peace. She does not clap back, she does not collapse, she simply does not move. She holds her ground with the patience of someone who has already paid the price of losing herself and has no intention of ever doing so again. This woman is not against love, on the contrary, she loves more fiercely, more honestly, and more freely now. But that love is no longer transactional. It does not come with conditions of self-erasure. It is a love rooted in sovereignty, in boundaries, in clarity. She will walk with you, but she will not carry you. She will listen to you, but she will not translate your intentions for your convenience. She will hold space for your healing, but she will not be collateral damage in the name of your growth. And if you mistake her peace for passivity, you will learn the hard way that her silence is not submission, it is discernment. She knows who she is now. Not because someone told her, not because someone validated her, but because she remembered. She remembered who she was before the world told her to be something else. She remembered the sound of her own voice. She remembered the feel of her own power. And once that remembering took root, there was no storm, no rejection, no misunderstanding strong enough to uproot it. She is not unreachable. She is simply no longer accessible to anything that costs her her dignity. That is what makes her powerful. That is what makes her dangerous to manipulators. And that is what makes her unforgettable. She is the woman who cannot be moved, not because she is made of stone, but because she is finally standing on ground that is hers, and hers alone.